Thanks for coming back. And next session, may I invite Professor John Lizza. Professor, please.
Thank you for coming. It's very nice to be here. I want to thank Professor Han Am Lee and the Center for Bioethics for inviting me here, and also the Department of Philosophy for inviting me to be here for the semester. It has been a more rewarding experience for me than I could have imagined. So I very much appreciate the opportunity. The concept of, I'm going to talk about specifically about potentiality and how it's figured in different bioethical debate. I'm actually going to really just focus on one particular type of argument. The concept of potentiality has figured prominently in debates over the beginning of human life, particularly abortion, the use of human embryos for research, and the moral status of frozen embryos. Indeed, the standard argument against abortion is that appeals to the intrinsic potentiality that embryos have to develop characteristics of personhood, such as consciousness, self-consciousness, and rationality. It's argued that in virtue of this potentiality, the embryo is deserving of respect, if not all the rights and protections that are normally accorded to persons. Proponents of this standard argument maintain that in virtue of such intrinsic or active potentiality, the embryo is an actual person with potential at an early stage of development and not a potential person. So as potentiality has been considered, one of the standard objections to invoking potentiality has been to say, well, you know, if something is a potential person, that doesn't entitle it to the same rights as actual persons, just as maybe, say, Prince Charles is a potential king of England, but that doesn't give him the rights and privileges of the king. Now, this argument actually gets around that argument, or that's the strategy to get around it, because what it maintains is that the embryo is a person from the moment of conception in virtue of the active potentiality that it has. So it's not a potential person, it's a person with potential. The potentiality is also figured in some of the debates and issues at the end of life, the moral status of individuals with total brain failure, those in permanent vegetative state, and those with severe dementia. It's also been an issue in when does death occur? Death is defined as an irreversible loss of circulation. It's defined as an irreversible loss of the integration of the organism as a whole, and the criteria are the irreversible cessation of circulation and respiration and the irreversible loss of all brain function, including the brainstem. So what irreversibility and potentiality are complementary concepts in the sense that we would say something is irreversible if there was no potential for it to be reversed. This has been a particular issue concerning non-heart beating organ donation, in which an individual who wants to become a donor and has executed a DNR order is declared death based on the loss of circulation and respiration. The transplant team will wait 2 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, in some reported cases 75 seconds after cardiac arrest before commencing the transplantation. And some critics of this protocol argue that the patient isn't dead because the cessation of circulation and respiration isn't irreversible. And I'll come back to this towards the end of the talk. Now, what I'm going to argue for is that the distinction between active and passive potentiality for characteristics of personhood, such as self-consciousness and rationality, that proponents of the argument invoke fails to apply in certain borderline cases at the beginning and end of life. Such cases include embryos with a genetic defect that prevents further development and individuals who have lost the intrinsic drive to breathe on their own. These individuals may have some internal impediment for an active potentiality to direct its activity, and therefore need to be acted on externally in order for the active potentiality to be effective. I argue that such potentiality cannot be classified as active or passive, and the potentiality in such cases is a relational property. And so I propose a third category called medical or technological potentiality for such cases. I then argue that if the individual in the borderline cases deserve the respect and rights of persons, there's no principal difference between them and somatic cells that can undergo cloning. In both cases, we are intervening in a way that can be construed as removing an impediment to the individual's intrinsic potentiality. So if we think that the technological potentiality of defective embryos warrants respect, then it warrants respecting all somatic cells, since the nucleus of such cells could be implanted in an enucleated egg to allow its intrinsic potential to go forward. However, it is clearly absurd to think that all somatic cells have equal moral standing, so potentiality in itself cannot be the basis for an embryo to have moral status as a moral status of a person. Now, if there are different types of potentiality, active, passive, and technological, then I think there's no reason to think that only one type of potentiality matters. We thus need to bring in other values and interests to decide which type of potentiality is ethically significant. So in the case of determining whether an individual satisfies the criterion of irreversible loss of brain or circulatory and respiratory functions, ethical considerations bear on whether we should apply a physiological concept of irreversibility, which means no potentiality for reversibility by the organism itself, so no possibility for say, resuscitation, or whether we should invoke a notion of medical irreversibility, where that means no potential for reversibility by any medical means. For example, I think ethical considerations support interpreting irreversibility to mean physiologically irreversible in the context of non-heart-beating organ donation, whereas medical irreversibility would be the appropriate meaning in the context of an emergency room. Similarly, ethical considerations are relevant to determining which concept of potentiality is ethically relevant at the beginning of life. Now, much more work is needed to consider the range of ethical considerations relevant to evaluating potentiality at the beginning of life. And that work is really beyond the scope of this paper. The paper is quite limited in really just considering one of these main arguments that's figured in the debate over abortion, and to try to deal with it on its own terms and to see where the concepts lead to. However, I will suggest at the end that actual or realistic possibility of a potentiality being realized is one consideration that affects the relevance of potentiality, regardless of whether it is passive, active, or technological. That is, if it's not actually or realistically possible for X to be or become Y, then any potential for X to be or become Y, if it exists at all, is for the most part ethically irrelevant. So to get at the arguments here, grounding their view in an Aristotelian metaphysics, in which things that exist by nature have innate principles to develop in certain ways, some bioethicists hold that the human embryo has the potential to develop characteristics such as intellect and will, or self-consciousness and rationality, by virtue of the kind of thing it is. According to this account, as long as an individual is a member of the kind human being, its potentiality, or human person, its potentiality to develop in certain ways is not affected by any internal or external impediments. Moreover, in this understanding of potentiality, whether an individual has any realistic or practical probability of developing these characteristics does not affect its potential. In considering the moral status of frozen embryos, the U.S. President's Council on Bioethics illustrates this view of potentiality at the beginning of life. So they write, an embryo is by definition and by its nature potentially a fully developed human person. Its potential for maturation is a characteristic it actually has, and from the start. The fact that embryos have been created outside their natural environment, which is to say outside the woman's body, and are therefore limited in their ability to realize their natural capacities, does not affect either the potential or the moral status of the beings themselves. A bird forced to live in a cage its entire life may never learn to fly, but this does not mean that it is less of a bird or that it lacks the imminent potentiality to fly on feathered wings. It only means only that a caged bird, like an in vitro human embryo, has been deprived of its proper environment. Now, at the other end of life, D. Alan Shewmon expresses a similar view about potentiality at the end of life when he claims that artificially sustained human organisms with total brain failure retain the potential for intellect and will. Shewmon argues that the potential for intellect and will resides not in any organ, for example, the brain, but in the organism as a whole. Since he believes that the human organism as a whole may persist through the loss of all brain functions, artificially sustained, of course, it retains the potential for intellect and will. He sees the loss of brain functions simply as an impediment in the actualization of the potential for intellect and will that remains in the organism. Its loss does not affect whether the organism has the potential. And he gives an analogy to support his view. He says, before cataract surgery, people with cataracts still had the potential for sight. Moreover, he claims that if someone suffered enucleation of both eyes and even removal or infarction of the entire visual cortex, the person would still retain the potential for sight. So he writes, as with the potency for sight, the potency for these functions, human intellection and will, ultimately resides not in the organ, but in the organism. Theoretically, if brains could be reconstituted, for example, through implanted futuristically transformed neuroblasts, a brain-dead person could be made to regain consciousness and other human functions, although perhaps with a clean mnemonic slate and new personality traits. Thus, if brain death does not cause a loss of somatic integrative unity, as it now seems not to, then neither does it cause a loss of essential human properties, that is, a loss of potency for the specifically human functions, potency at the most profound ontological level at which the occurrence or note of substantial change is determined. So again, it's a reliance on this view that things have the potential they have in virtue of the kind of thing they are. So since he rejects brain death as death, he thinks it's still a human organism that is alive and therefore still has the potential. Now, by active potentiality, it goes back to a notion in Aristotle as a kind of organism's intrinsic power of setting itself in movement and arresting itself. Jason Erbel, a proponent of this view that I'm discussing, says something has an active potentiality if it has within itself everything necessary, given its proper design environment. So it needs some environment in order to exist, a normal environment or suitable environment, to actualize itself in the relevant manner. These theorists also locate the potentiality in the organism's genetic and epigenetic manner. Again, the idea here is a substance, like a human organism, has the active potentiality regardless of whether the potentiality is ever realized or developed. Again, the passage from the US President's Counsel, the bird in the cage, still has the potential to fly. The unfolding of an individual's active potentiality also does not change the kind of thing it is. It remains the same substance throughout the change. So a human embryo is a person, again, with potential, not a potential person. Passive potentiality, on the other hand, Erbel writes, he says something has a passive potentiality if it can become the subject of externally directed change, such that it can become what it is not now already now. So, for example, a block of wood has a passive potentiality to become a statue because it has to be acted on by something outside of it. Or a pile of building materials has a passive potentiality to become a house. It doesn't have any kind of internal power. It's not in this, like a being becoming on the way to becoming a house when it's a pile of materials. And they also claim that embryonic and somatic cells lack the genetic and epigenetic factors to direct their development to become self-conscious and rational in the natural and normal environment. Embryonic and somatic cells need to be acted upon in ways that change the kind of things they are. So they are not persons with potential, but they would consider them potential persons. Now, there's disagreement over what exactly are the material conditions for active potentiality, even among people who make this argument. So the question raises sort of, when does an organism lack an active potentiality? What's the biological substrate necessary for the potential for self-consciousness and rationality? So if we consider, for example, an embryo with a genetic defect that will prevent it from developing self-consciousness and rationality, does it lack the active potentiality to develop self-consciousness and rationality? Suppose we had an anencephalic developing embryo. Would you say that that has the same potentiality as a normal, healthy human embryo? Or is the alternative is to say that the genetic defect is just an impediment in the realization of the active potentiality that it has at a more fundamental level in virtue of its nature as a human organism. The same issue arises at the end of life. So people talk about, say, does a cryopreserved human organism, an artificially sustained brain-dead human organism, or an individual in PVS lack the active potentiality for self-consciousness and rationality? Or again, are these just conditions merely impediments in the realization of the active potentiality that the human organism has at a more fundamental level in virtue of the kind of thing it is, a human organism? So in discussing cryopreservation, for example, philosopher Van Inwagen holds that a cryopreserved organism has the potentiality, since it's disposed to expand to its normal state at the moment sufficient energy becomes available to it. So Van Inwagen writes this. He says, before the cat was frozen, its life consisted of mostly chemical reactions and various relatively large-scale physical processes, the breaking and establishing of chemical bonds, the movement of fluid under hydraulic pressure, the transport of ions. When the cat was frozen, its life was squeezed into various small-scale physical processes, the orbiting of electrons and exchange of photons by charged particles. Its life became the sum of these subchemical changes that underlie and constitute chemical changes and large-scale physical change. But he says the life was there, disposed to expand to its normal state at the moment sufficient energy should become available to it. I, who am fond of oxymorons, he describes this as a living corpse. On the other hand, Jason Erbel answers this question, no. He says a cryopreserved body lacks its own motive principle to reanimate itself, and he thinks that at most it has a passive potentiality. A cryopreserved body is not sufficiently disposed to be a living ensouled organism, since it does not have the internal capacity to coordinate its metabolic functions. So what Erbel also thinks is that these subchemical changes that Van Inwagen is referring to could also persist in a corpse. And so the view would commit you to saying that a corpse has the active potential for self-consciousness and rationality. Now, again, Erbel disagrees with Shewmon on the question of whether the brain-dead body has an active potentiality. He thinks it's lost its vital functions. It no longer has this intrinsic motive principle to breathe on its own. And he says, contrast someone who needs bypass surgery, who still retains some control of vital functions. Now, I think that Herbal is right that whether an individual has an active potentiality as opposed to a passive potentiality turns on how the requisite disposition should be defined. However, it's entirely unclear whether such a disposition can be defined in a non-arbitrary way to resolve the borderline cases. For example, while the bypass patient is certainly functioning metabolically, it's unclear what type of control the patient has over those functions, and therefore whether the patient has, in Aristotle's terms, in itself the power of setting itself in movement and arresting itself. Isn't it precisely the lack of such a motive principle that necessitates the bypass operation? Moreover, suppose a patient permanently required a mechanical ventilator, pacemaker, or artificial heart. In Herbal's view, quote, if a person cannot actually perform his vital metabolic functions, then he is dead. Many patients, however, have been permanently dependent on artificial life support, for example, those who were dependent on iron lungs, but it would be absurd to consider them dead. So I agree with Herbal's criticism of Van Inwagen. If Van Inwagen recognizes the cryopreserved body to have an active potentiality, then he would have to allow an inanimate but structurally preserved corpse to have the same potentiality. But this would be absurd. Neither being is going anywhere on its own. Both lack the supposed, quote, motive principle to develop in certain ways. Herbal, again, would say that the cryopreserved body has at best a passive or weak potential to develop intellect and will. Now, in other work, I've charged Shewmon with a similar difficulty. If an artificially sustained human organism with no brain function has the potential for intellect and will, then I see no non-arbitrary grounds for not attributing this same potential to an artificially sustained decapitated human organism, the cryopreserved body, or even a corpse. Perhaps instead of just implementing future neuroblasts, we also implant other materials and energy that generate the restoration of life in the cryopreserved body or corpse. Presumably, the kind of consciousness and other functions that would be restored would be human. Would we take this to mean that all along these individuals had the active potential for intellect and will? I think to do so would blur the distinction between active and passive potentiality and make the distinction useless for deciding any of the borderline cases. Now, Shewmon has suggested that we should recognize when we talk about potentiality, there might be sort of an immediate potentiality or capacity that someone has versus the capacity to develop a capacity for something. And he says this shouldn't be, we shouldn't understand this capacity to develop a capacity in an overly restrictive sense. It need not develop spontaneously, but he says it should accommodate instances where external elimination of some impediment is required for the development to proceed. So he goes on to say, to distinguish the potential for X without assistance, the potential for X with assistance, and performance of X by an external agent. And he gives some examples. He says, we shouldn't adopt an interpretation of radical capacity so strict that the facts that the healing of large wounds requires sutures, the healing of fractures requires plates, and recovery from serious infections requires antibiotics would negate the body's radical capacity for self-healing. Similarly, the radical potential for sight should be understood as present in someone with dense cataracts, even though ophthalmological surgery is necessary to actualize the potential. The hidden regenerative potentials of mammals, including humans, which are actualizable through epigenetic suppression, are now beginning to come to light. If a certain kind of self-repair requires assistance to become actualized, that should not negate the existence of a radical capacity for self-repair any more than requiring external assistance to survive negates being alive. Now, I think the ophthalmologic surgery and desuppression of epigenetic factors are more controversial than, say, the healing of wounds, especially if the surgery or epigenetic intervention is unknown or unavailable. The problem is that if we construe these measures as assistance in helping an individual realize certain active potentiality, it may lead to ascribing the same active potentialities to other individuals that we are inclined to say do not have them, and may therefore make the concept of active potentiality so promiscuous as to be useless. For example, if we allow for genetic and epigenetic intervention within the realm of the potential for X with assistance, as Shewmon was saying, the desuppression of genes, it is unclear why we should not attribute the potential for intellect and will to human embryonic and somatic cells. Why not construe cloning as assisting a human cell to realize its active potential for intellect and will, as opposed to the performance of X by an external agent? We cannot assist, at least given the current state of knowledge, the cells of an acorn to develop intellect and will because they lack the requisite internal genetic and epigenetic material. However, since this is much more realistically possible with human cells, isn't that an indication that they have different active potentialities from acorn cells, and therefore that they have the potential for intellect and will with assistance? So R. Altacharo has argued that with the advent of nuclear transfer cloning to actualize the potential of every somatic cell, there is no significant difference between the assistant that skin cells need to generate a baby and that of in vitro embryos. Both, she writes, need a culture medium. For skin cells, the medium is found in the cytoplasm of an enucleated cell, but a medium it is nonetheless. The skin cell needs an electric shock. Again, however, it is unclear why electricity, as opposed to the warmth of the incubator used in ordinary management of an embryo, an in vitro embryo, is of ontological significance. And Charo adds that, in addition, she says, the implicit nature of a skin cell is also to divide and grow. With the discovery that genes coding for non-skin functions are merely dormant rather than dead, comes from the observation that the nature of skin cells and that of embryonic cells are not terribly different. Furthermore, and I think this is particularly interesting, when current research on somatic cell nuclear transfer cloning unlocks the secrets to the role of the egg cytoplasm in regulating the expressions of genes that code for development of an entire organism, the next step in cloning will be to eliminate the need for fusion within a enucleated egg. All the material needed to regulate gene expression is present in the cytoplasm of the skin cell as well, and turning that expression on by manipulation of the skin cell alone will be the final step in eliminating all pertinent difference between embryonic cells and adult cells. Charo's claim is that if there is no significant difference between the potential of skin cells and in vitro embryos, then if we think that in vitro embryos have rights and should be protected because of their potentiality, every somatic cell would be deserving of the same rights and protections, which he thinks is absurd. Now, Russell de Silvestro challenges Charo's argument on the grounds that the effect of the assistance is different. He holds that in the case of assisting skin cells, the skin cells are transformed into a different kind of thing, a human organism. A new kind of being is generated. In contrast, De Silvestro argues when an in vitro embryo develops into a baby, the embryo is numerically the same thing as the baby and is the same kind of thing as the baby, namely an individual human organism. So what Charo is considering as the final stage of cloning procedure didn't involve the implantation of the nucleus of the cell into another cell, but could be done by the cytoplasm, you wouldn't have this problem, I think, where you have a different individual. It'd be the same individual. So I think the issue here is, it seems to be that any appeal to the distinction between an organism undergoing a change in kind versus a qualitative change to resolve the issue of whether an artificially sustained brain-dead body has the active potential for self-consciousness and rationality will not help, since at issue is whether such bodies are dead, whether they are still members of the kind human being. And so the question, are we intervening in an individual with the active potential with assistance, or an individual who lacks the potential even with assistance? In other words, you can't appeal to say, well, the debate between Herbal and Shewmon is whether a brain-dead organism, human organism, being or individual, is dead or not. And so, but that's exactly what's at issue here. So to try to appeal to that claim is not going to, when the issue really is whether it has or doesn't have an active potentiality. So there seems to be some circularity there. So there's a kind of dilemma, I think, of potentiality. If artificially sustained brain-dead bodies have an active potentiality for consciousness and rationality, why not attribute it to other kinds of bodies, such as cryopreserved bodies, corpses, and apes? But if human bodies that require artificial support for vital functions do not have an active potentiality for self-consciousness and rationality, shouldn't we deny that anyone dependent on artificial support is alive and therefore lacks the potentiality? So I think this notion of active potentiality gets both individuals, Herbal, both sides, into trouble because they have counterintuitive implications or applications. Maybe we have the same kind of dilemma at the beginning of life. If defective embryos that can be assisted have an active potentiality for self-consciousness and rationality, so let's say there's a minor defect in the embryo, it wouldn't do it on its own, but we can intervene. Why not attribute it to other kinds of bodies, such as embryonic and somatic cells, that require the assistance of being implanted into a nucleated cell or of gene desuppression? But if embryonic and somatic cells do not have an active potentiality for self-consciousness and rationality, shouldn't we deny that defective embryos requiring assistance lack the same active potentiality? So I think I'm inclined to say there is an active potentiality there, but this view would commit us to denying it. So what I want to suggest is that the potentiality for an organism in these borderline situations is neither active nor passive. Since it depends on being acted upon, is not simply an intrinsic active potentiality, and since it depends on its having some intrinsic but insufficient potentiality, it is not simply, or impeded potentiality, it is not simply a passive potentiality. The new technology, I think, has created another sense of potentiality, which medical or technological potentiality. So is potentiality ethically relevant? Well, if we think that technological potentiality of many impaired individuals at the end of life requiring life support gives them as much moral standing as individuals that do not require life support, the technological potentiality of individuals with more extreme impairments, such as total brain failure and PVS, would give them as much moral standing as individuals that do not require life support. But I think it's absurd to think that individuals in total brain failure or PVS have such a high moral standing because they have at some fundamental level the potential for self-consciousness and rationality. So whether an individual has a passive or active or technological potentiality in itself, I don't think it can be what gives an individual special moral standing. And a similar type of argument can be made about the embryos. If we think that the technological potentiality of embryos requiring intervention gives them as much moral standing as embryos that do not require intervention, then the technological potentiality of embryonic and somatic cells would give them as much moral standing as embryos that do not require intervention. But it's absurd to think that embryonic and somatic cells have such a high moral standing, that is, that they are persons with potential and not potential persons. So again, whether an individual has a passive, active, or technological potentiality in itself cannot be what gives an individual special moral standing. So what makes potentiality ethically relevant? And again, this is a much larger question, and but I'm going to maybe try to suggest a couple of things here. I think the ethical considerations of potentiality are relevant to the context, and I'll give an example of that, and then, which I mentioned at the start of the talk, involving non-heart-beating organ donation and the declaration of death, and that actual possibility and probability to realize the potential is also something that's ethically relevant. So, as I mentioned, in these cases of non-heart-beating organ transplantation, there's this issue about whether these donors are really dead, because the claim is that they still have a potential to have the cessation of circulation and respiration be reversed. Some philosophers take different sides on this issue. Don Marquis thinks that since it's actually possible to reverse the cessation of circulation and respirations of the donors have the potential for circulation and respiration, and therefore they're not dead. So he thinks it is a violation of the dead donor rule to remove organs from these individuals. The dead donor rule says you can't take vital organs unless someone is dead. And so I think what's at issue here is, do, say, the DNR orders and the express wishes of the donor to participate in the transplant procedure affect what it means for these donors to have a, quote, potential for circulation and respiration following cardiac arrest? Well, Tomlinson is one who thinks that it does. He says, and I also agree with Tomlinson, he says that there are various meanings of irreversibility. Irreversibility means one thing, he thinks, in an emergency room, and another thing in the context of hospice care or non-heart-beating organ transplantation. The relevant meaning of irreversibility in the criteria for determining death is determined by ethical and legal considerations related to the medical practice of declaring death. So Tomlinson identifies different senses of irreversibility. There's a sort of metaphysical sense of that a condition is irreversible if it can never be reversed or not reversible in any possible world. But this would not be a very useful meaning of irreversibility. We probably could then never know whether anyone was dead if we had to consider all possible worlds, and never could then declare death. So I think, again, a logical possibility here, or metaphysical possibility, absolute possibility, is not a very good guide to conduct. So I think the meaning of irreversible must be understood relative to the actual world and our accepted practice and context of declaring death. So Tomlinson goes on to identify another meaning of irreversibility. He says, not reversible by the organism itself, that is, by autoresuscitation. And this would be to think of reversibility or irreversibility as an internal property of the organism. And that's probably the only sense of irreversibility we had, years before we introduced technology that allowed us to do resuscitation. That is, we thought the condition was irreversible. If we couldn't do anything, so it was determined by what was in the individual, whether they could reverse the cessation of functions on their own. But what has happened now is, with the technology, we've introduced a new meaning of irreversibility, that is, not reversible by medical means. And in this sense, irreversibility is no longer an intrinsic property of an organism, but it's a relational property. It's dependent on knowledge and ability. So although it may sound sort of counterintuitive or implausible, on this view, it's possible then for two people in the same internal physical state to be alive and the other dead, right? Why? Because, well, in one case, the individual may have the possibility of medically reversing it, and in another case, we didn't. Just think of the difference over time, and maybe we can even say the same with contemporaneous situations. So someone on the side of Mount Everest, inaccessible to medical care, may be irreversibly, it may be irreversible, it may be an irreversible condition, whereas that same individual in the same physical state at a modern clinic would have the possibility of their condition being reversed. And finally, he introduces this notion of ethical irreversibility. What he means here is not ethically reversible. So he thinks that what we have these different meanings of irreversibility. It's not like there's only one meaning. So he thinks that we actually have a choice of which sense of irreversibility we're going to apply in a given situation. And the answer to that question should be grounded in some ethical considerations. So medical irreversibility is the appropriate concept to apply in a given context, say the emergency room, where someone comes in, their heart stopped. We're not going to say, oh, they can't auto-resuscitate, so we're actually going to not declare death until maybe we think it's medically irreversible. But in other contexts, say in a hospice setting or in the non-heart beating organ donation, Tomlinson suggests that we could use physiological irreversibility, that seems to be ethically justifiable in such a case, and that physicians will routinely declare people dead in a hospice setting without necessarily ensuring that it's medically irreversible. And so following Tomlinson, I want to suggest maybe there's different senses of potentiality, a passive sense in which the potential of an organism to be or become X in any possible world by external intervention. Again, that would be not a very useful notion of potentiality. In some senses, as Joel Feinberg has pointed out, any bit of matter is maybe potentially anything else. We just have to adjust the conditions. Powdered orange juice is potentially orange juice, just add water. It's potentially orange cake, just add flour and eggs and bake, and right. So that's a sort of paradox of potentiality. So active potentiality, we can maybe use this notion of an intrinsic potential for an organism to be or become X, given a natural or normal environment. So that's one meaning that the word might have. But then there's medical or technological potentiality, and this is the potential for an organism to be or become X with technological assistance in the actual world. And this would make potentiality, again, I think, like irreversibility, a relational property dependent on knowledge and ability. And then finally, an ethical sense of irreversibility, which would enable us to decide which of alternative senses we think are relevant in a given context. Okay, how am I set for time here? This is what... That's it? Yikes. Okay, I'm not going to be able to do this. What I wanted to talk a bit about was the connection between possibility and potentiality. This is sort of maybe a common assumption that if something has a potential for something, it must be possible for it to be or become that thing. How could something have a potential and yet there be no possibility for it to become that thing? And so then the question is, well, what's the sense of possibility involved here? It can't be logical possibility, maybe physical possibility consistent with physical laws, or maybe a more narrow sense of realistic or actual possibility, which is what has been suggested by Edward Covey, and which I think makes sense. This is a sense in which something is consistent with physical laws, but more restrictive. So it may be physically possible for an acorn to grow into a tree that produces pears, but since we currently have no idea how this might be done, it's not realistically or actually possible. And I think that's actually the correct sense here. Let me just maybe throw out a couple of cases. One case would be, say, suppose we categorize an anencephalic embryo as a human embryo. So let's even grant that it has an active potential, as the proponents of the argument maintain. Or it has an active potential for intellect and will with assistance, right? And a human skin cell has only a passive potentiality for intellect and will, because it will need to undergo transformation in kind caused by an external agent, for instance, cloning. Suppose that the assistance provided to the anencephalic involved correcting some genetic defect, and that the correction, because it is only assistance, would preserve the identity of the embryo over time. Suppose that, in contrast, the cloning of the skin cell would not preserve its identity, but would create a new kind of being. Although a human being with the potential for intellect and will might result from the cloning procedure, that individual wouldn't be identified with the skin cell. Well, does that really make a difference? Does the active potentiality and identity preservation make a moral difference in how the individual should be treated? We can think of cases where, suppose we had the technology to clone, but we didn't have the technology to correct the genetic defect, and suppose there was some crisis where we had to increase the population for some extraordinary reason. Then I don't think the fact that we might be transforming one thing into another kind of thing would really matter. The kind of potentiality that would matter would be relative to those kinds of interests we have. If you take another case, think about, say, if an embryo has the genetic wherewithal to develop self-consciousness and rationality, but it's situated, say, in the uterus of a woman whose uterus is unable to sustain it, so scarred that implantation is impossible. Does that embryo have the same potentiality as the embryo in, say, a healthy womb? A variation on this, or would we say it doesn't really have any actual possibility, and therefore it doesn't have the same potentiality? Or suppose we contrast two different individuals, say the woman with the scarred uterus, but who's in a clinic, and we have a surrogate available so we can flush the uterus and take the embryo out and implant it. As contrasted with, say, a woman who is not in a clinic and we don't have a surrogate, and it's impractical to think or impossible to think how we could make those arrangements in any actual sense, would the potentiality of those individuals differ? And I think the most interesting kind of case is, suppose you had an embryo in a woman whose uterus was unable to sustain it, but, and you offered her the idea of flushing the uterus and implanting it into a surrogate, the embryo into a surrogate. And suppose she refuses. Well, do we think that embryo doesn't have the potential or the possibility of developing self-consciousness and rationality? Does her decisional factors, which we might think we have good ethical reason for supporting, put a limit then on its potentiality? Or even if we admit it has an active potentiality, does it put a limit on whether that active potentiality has any ethical relevance? So the sort of the upshot of this, what I'm trying to suggest is that in cases in which there's no actual possibility for an active potentiality to be realized due to either internal privation or external barriers that cannot be rectified, then the potentiality has little or no ethical significance. Since we cannot do anything to help the thing realize its potential, it has little bearing on how we ought to act. But in cases in which we could do something to rectify the internal privation or remove the external barriers, the ethical significance of potentiality cannot be determined independently of an ethical consideration of whether our intervention to correct the privation or remove the external barriers is justified. If there are strong ethical reasons for thinking that intervention should not take place or that the barriers should not be removed, then the potentiality will and ought to have little ethical significance in our deliberations. So, okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lizza. And next, may I invite Dr. Cansu to make her response. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Lee, for inviting me, and thank you, Professor Lizza, for answering all my questions since yesterday. So I'm actually quite convinced that the active and passive potentiality distinction is a messy distinction, and the question that I am much more interested in is whether we have any reason to bother with this distinction, any moral reason. So the active-passive potentiality debate seems to assume that there's a decisive moral significance of this whole potentiality concept. And it's not just moral relevance, but rather something much more stronger than that. So quoting from Professor Lizza's paper, so there's disagreement over whether anencephalic fetuses and infants have the biological substrate necessary for the active potential for intellect and will, and therefore whether they should be accorded the same rights and respects as normal human beings. So from this quote, it seems like the whole potentiality debate immediately jumps us to this equal rights type of thing, which is extremely debatable, obviously. So the question, I think, is that I find more important here is that on what grounds can we argue for such a moral significance of the potentiality? So does the potential person, can we really say the potential person has the same rights as an actual person? The example, I think, from Singer's, do we value the seed as much as we value the full tree? In the similar way we talk about humans. So it seems like the moral significance of the question, does excess potentiality for personhood, rests on this idea what makes personhood morally significant. And obviously that requires us to have some sort of explanation of what kind of a personhood we are talking about. So very broadly, there are two ways that we can look at it. I know that Professor Lizza has much refined distinctions for this, but one way of looking at it is basically belonging to the human species and saying embryo is already a person. So this is the one that was referred as not the potential person, but person with a potential. So we already assume that embryo is a person. Of course, that sort of gets us in all sorts of trouble, for example, thinking that if the embryo is already a person, then we are basically giving it the same rights as a full human being? So if we are supposed to save a human versus an embryo, are we going to say, well, both would be equally right? And other thing is that how do we compare this to the other species? Do we think that belonging to the human species give a particular value to this embryo, or the embryo is still less valuable than a, I don't know, full dolphin or something that has much more capacity? Or the other way of looking at it, looking at the personhood, could be looking at the particular qualities that we associate with the personhood, so maybe the intellect or the will. And in that case, we have this idea of embryo is not yet a person, but it is becoming a person, so this potential person way of looking at it. And again, I think Singer's argument for this was, well, Prince Charles has a potential to become a king of England, but it doesn't mean that at the moment we are going to give him the rights of the king. If he actualizes this potential, then we are talking about the same rights. And if that's the case, then how much of a value, how much of the rights are we attaching to the embryo? And of course, that would also mean, if we are putting on a scale, that would also mean, that would most likely mean that the potential person will have much weaker rights, or we will have much weaker obligations towards the potential person. So I think this does mean that, of course, the potentiality and the potential person has a moral relevance, but it doesn't yet get us to this decisive moral significance. So, and I do think that this moral relevance, rather than this decisiveness, fits much better with the other, well, for example, with these two ethical systems that we operate in most arguments. So, for example, if we look at from a Kantian perspective, I think we would not consider an embryo, we would not assign humanity to the embryo, because in the Kantian system, what we focus on is usually these agents with existing rational and moral capacities and self-reflection. And we would still have imperfect duties, some weaker duties towards these potential persons, towards these embryos, but that would be always has to be juggled with other duties that we have, other considerations that we have. Utilitarianism is obviously straightforward. If we do think that the potential person is not yet a full person, then we would consider this potentiality in relation to all these other considerations that we have. So this actually seems to, from what I understand, this doesn't really conflict with what Professor Lizza was saying about this potentiality's ethical significance being sort of dependent on its proximity or probability of realization. So instead of taking potentiality as something that's definitive, we are looking at it as what it requires to actually realize it, or what it requires what proximity we have, what resources we need in order to realize it. So that would also mean that we don't actually have a need to operate with concepts of potentiality that are consistent within these different circumstances, but rather the considerations come into play with the surrounding factors. So, for example, in the beginning of life, destroying an embryo does not take away the life plans of a person, the embryo as the person, or bringing it into life. The example that Professor Lizza was giving about for example, if there is a hostile uterus and the woman has the embryo, she doesn't want the embryo to be flushed out. Well, it seems like the considerations here are, yes, there is the rights of the woman, and we would be, taking the view that the embryo is a person with a potential, so has the full rights as much as the woman, seems to be not very well placed. Similar, in different circumstances, we would take into consideration different things. A person's life after cardiac arrest would be obviously very valuable, and if there is a lot we can do about it, then the proximity of realization, proximity of getting back to the full consciousness would be what we will be focusing at. And obviously, temporary coma would be a clear case where we don't require a lot of resources. We can conceivably think that we can reverse these conditions, and obviously we would have much more moral reason to help the person. So in terms of defining death, how the potentiality comes into play in defining death, so the distinction that Professor Lizza was making was the earlier account of irreversibility of functions like circulatory and respiratory functions was based on the natural history of the biological organisms on its own, and whereas the modern account must take into consideration the possibility of external intervention. So with the external intervention, though, we are talking about not only the medical technology that we have, but also the ethical decision-making that we have. So the advanced directives, what the person wants, should we if there's a do not resuscitate order, are we gonna say that, well, the person is dead now because we are not gonna do anything about it, whereas in the same condition, the person is another person who does not have the order is still alive. I do think that having two individuals in the exact same biological condition, claiming one is dead before we claim the other one is dead, seems to be a conceptual problem. Also a problem, I think, the way we understand death in general. So I don't think that our intentions or the person's intention, the dying person's intentions, plays such a strong role in how we define death, but it's more like this, our epistemic understanding of the irreversibility. So what we know about irreversibility, what we conceive of irreversibility. Like looking back to the distinctions that Professor Lizza just presented, I think the epistemic one that I'm talking about here includes this physiological one back in the day only, and now the physiological and the medical one combined, what we conceive of doing. And in the donation after cardiac death cases, I don't think this is actually such a terrible thing. Yes, that would mean that we are taking the organs from donors before they die. And it is uncomfortable to think about it like that, but the point is not that we are killing, we mean to kill them, we intend to cause their death, but basically we are asking, well, this person is gonna be dead in 2 minutes or 5 minutes, and should we start the donation procedure 5 minutes before? And I don't think this is calling it, changing the definition of death such that it does not violate the dead donor rule is not necessarily a solution for the moral problem if there is one. And I think it's strongly debatable whether there is there's a problem there. And I think that is it.
Thank you. May I invite Dr. Zhang Jia and Professor Lizza and Professor Li to come up for panel discussion.
Thank you to both of you. And we have something like 12 minutes for discussion. And I think we'll do the same thing. I'll take maybe 3 or 4 questions. But this time I will throw out the first question, if I may. And my question is that when you, Professor Lizza, you were talking about the moral status of of something being the potential person, it seems to imply that a potential person doesn't have much moral status, I think. And my question is this. My question is, people, for example, Peter Singer and other people, they want to argue that a potential person doesn't have the right of a full person. That's true. But the question, though, is the cup half empty or is it half full? Prince Charles is not the king, but neither is he a commoner. So having recognized that a potential person is not a full person, or the moral status is not the same, we are not done with that issue yet. So that's the first question. Would anyone raise any question, Professor Huang?
Just follow up your question, add something. In some sense, maybe the potential king has more ethical value than actual king. Suppose you kill the actual king, the potential king can become the king. But suppose potential king is the only son or only kind of like the child in the family, right? And you kill the potential king, then actually there is no kind of like this kind of monarchy afterwards. But that's the kind of maybe not a real question.
Is that Professor Sin?
Hi, my name is William Sin. I'm from the Hong Kong Institute of Education. I'm asking a question regarding the concept of proximity or remoteness. It seems to me that initially, when we are thinking about the potentiality of an entity, we will look at the internal qualities of this entity. However, gradually, when we are talking about environmental conditions such as technology, then we look at wider features or factors in the environment, which Professor Lizza may describe it as a passive potentiality. And I'm thinking, if we are looking at a large range of factors, then will we also consider the cultural environment of the society? For instance, if it is a very conservative society, then would it weaken the potential of the fetus to actualize? Or whether the mother's decision to abort the fetus or not will affect the potentiality of the fetus at all. But if it does, then it would be a bit strange, because the argument of potentiality principle was initially suggest to reject the permissibility of abortion. But now in our assessment of the idea of potentiality, it seems that we may have to consider a range of factors which may include the plan of the mother.
Okay, enough. Should we ask? How many more questions? Okay, one more. Should we get that one? Mr. Lam, and then that's it.
I'm extending the subject way wider than the current scope. I just think about when you consider potentiality. I can consider education as being potentiality adding. So if society has $1 million to spend, should I put somebody on cryogenetic just to preserve the potential of there being life that may be extended? Or should I help a poor kid who otherwise wouldn't be able to be put through the schooling? So it's almost like, how do you quantify potentiality? I've got a child at 3 years old. If I do spend money on him, so in a way, so the minute you mention potential, it'll be, okay, can I extend it to all human race? But that really extends the discussion. I'm not sure how we can achieve some kind of framework to quantify and assess the priorities.
Okay, yeah, all very, very interesting questions. The focus of this paper was really was quite narrow in terms of just saying, here's a particular argument that a lot of people have tried to defend, to make the claim that the embryo is an actual person from the get-go, and they've relied on this notion, and that doesn't work. If we start to talk about the value of a potential person, which was I didn't really take any position on that. I would agree with you that there actually is a difference between when something that we think of value is on the way or has a potential, then we value it more than maybe something else that doesn't have that potential. So which is and that's to I think in Johnson's comments, you seem to suggest that it was just a matter of whether we were interested in the result, or that a Singer's view that it's only when an individual actually can demonstrate or has the immediate capability of, say, consciousness and rationality that the individual has value. And I would sort of shy away from that. I think that there's some sense here that we would say that even if it doesn't actually have it now, something having the potential does have some value. Yes.
So just
sure.
one thing. So I do think that there is value. So that's why I do say that there is moral relevance, but I wouldn't say it's a decisive moral significance. So it's not as heavy as the abortion argument.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's why my paper here is very limited, because the question that you raised, the fourth question about, well, what goes into, then now evaluating how much weight we give something potential. And yeah, there's a lot of things I think that that need to be considered. It's not a simple question, but the point is that you're not going to get much headway by this active-passive thing. So then if we just say, well, we're talking about potential that we could realize technologically or not, so, and what's that? And then we may have a sense where there are things that are already kind of on the way, and I think that gives those things a certain kind of standing or concern that we have. Whether it overrides other kinds of concerns that we have, which is a lot of what you were saying. I mean, I agree that there's a lot more work that needs to be done to answer that type of question. So maybe it could be that the potential king has more value than an actual king, depending on like what the circumstances are. That's right. So it's not just either way, that if it's just potential, it doesn't have value, it doesn't. It's just you're going to have to take a number of things into consideration. The question about proximity and remoteness, I think is relevant. I mean, Joel Feinberg observes, and I think this is true, when we talk about potentiality, there's usually an assumption that in the natural or normal course of events, such and such will take place. But the problem is when you start to talk about a natural or normal course of events, those are normative notions. And if you think about when we're talking about human beings, what's kind of normative for us is that we shape the environment. We determine what's a suitable environment based on considerations of the good. And that just complicates the issue very, very much. So in a sense, I'm saying, yeah, you can't really talk about potentialities or what ethical significance they have, independent of consideration of the good and these broader kinds of questions. So it's not, and I tend to have a kind of a gradualist view. I do think that early on in as the fetus develops and gets closer to coming to term and relationships build up with that fetus, then maybe those are considerations I think that bear on maybe what we're going to, or what value or we're going to recognize in the fetus. But I'm also troubled here by Don Marquis's argument opposing abortion. Now, Marquis has a very simple argument for why abortion is wrong, and it's actually a potentiality argument. It's not this potentiality argument. It doesn't, depend on any act that we pass. It's a very simple argument. It says that he asks, well, what makes killing one of us wrong? And he says, what makes killing one of us wrong is that it deprives us of a future of value. The individual, which, another way of putting it, I think it's an argument about potentiality. That is, it cuts the individual off from its potential to experience future goods. And he argues that, well, the fetus has a future of value, right? And so by depriving the fetus of it, by abortion, then he thinks it's prima facie wrong because it's cutting that individual off from the potential. So I think that's a different kind of argument invoking potentiality. Now, there have been a lot of discussion of that particular argument, and I'm not sure. I'm worried about the argument that it will lead to saying contraception is wrong, and then even somatic cells. If we can trace back the potential for a future value to somatic cells given cloning technology, then maybe there's got to be some problem then with thinking that what makes killing wrong is that it deprives individuals of a future of value. Now, there's a series of arguments that are out there where Marquis tries to block that move, that it leads to a regress. I'm not sure that it does. Let me just note one other thing. That is there time? Yeah. Some of the disagreement between us and the disagreement over potentiality has to do with whether you treat the person as a substantive kind of being as opposed to just a quality or a phase of the being. So Singer, I think, thinks, well, we go through a personhood phase when we have consciousness and rationality, and then we're no longer the person. He doesn't track the person through the entire life history of that human organism, right? Whereas the proponents of this argument that I was considering here do that, and there's other views that want to treat person as more of a substantive entity. I have that view myself. So the problem with the discussion of potentiality is people really are talking past each other. So when we say something like, well, the potential, it's only a potential prince and not an actual prince, not an actual king, therefore it doesn't have the rights. We're using, prince, that example, is a phase sortal. It's a kind of a phase that something goes through. It's not something that applies throughout the individual's existence. So the people who are making these arguments on both sides, I think, are to a large extent talking past each other. And there's a more fundamental issue here about what is a person, and and whether we understand a person as a human being or as a psychological kind of substance or just a phase, a certain set of qualities. And that's really underlying this debate, I think, at the beginning of life, when life begins. I also think it's really what's at stake in defining death. That different views about the nature of the person bear on whether you would want to accept, say, a higher brain formulation of death or a whole brain formulation or a non-brain formulation. You know, and I think that we've actually, well, maybe we haven't, but I mean, one lesson I think maybe of all the debate over abortion is that we've seen that people seem to differ on the question of the moral status and whether the fetus is a person. And I think we're just, at the end of life, we're dealing with a similar issue. It's not simply a biological fact when people die, just as it's not a simple biological fact of when we say one of us, a human being, a person, comes into existence.
Dr. Canca, do you have anything to add to any of this?
Yes, I have a question. So, going back to this king and prince distinction and the distinction between the person and the embryo adult. So, in that case, if you think that the personhood is this overarching thing between the embryo and adult, and in that case, we are not talking about, in the prince comparison, we are not talking about assigning the king's rights to the prince, right? So what kind of rights are they assigning to the whole thing in that case?
Yeah, right. Well, if you look at it that way, then there's going to be some value in terms of like the potentiality. So I think the potentiality has sort of value independent of whether it's going to actually be realized.
So royal family.
Yeah, okay. So then, right. So as some of the considerations that Han was bringing up would be relevant to its treatment, and I don't. My sort of metaphysical view is I have a kind of constitutive view of the relation between the person and the human organism, and so this is a case. I think where you have a natural kind of thing, a human organism that's developing in a certain way, and at some point you get these characteristics of personhood like consciousness. But what I haven't sort of thought enough about was what's the relationship between that natural trajectory and our value of the potentiality for that organism to develop into a person. I think it may be different than if it were just sort of an artificial kind of construction. So, for example, if you take the example of, let's say, the work of art, and you say it has a potential, that's a really artifact to become a sculpture. That's not, that I think, the value of that marble might depend on, how much how important it is maybe to realize it. So if Michelangelo is going to be working on it the next day, then it would have more value to it. If it wasn't, it wouldn't. But with natural kinds of things like human organisms, I think, and persons, I think it's not just that. I think there's more to it, but I'm not sure.
Now I think that's time for these sessions, and thank you so very much to Professor John Lizza and Dr. Canca. I'd also like to thank the early speaker, Professor Jacobs, and also the earliest discussant, Dr. Chen. Okay. And lastly, thank you very much for coming and to this talk. Thank you so much.